Hey, how's it going?
Hey, it's going well. How's it going with you?
Pretty good. I was just reading through the update on that PR. Thanks for all the work you put into that. That is an incredibly comprehensive response. Really appreciate it. I haven't digested it all yet, but I've got some time later today to reread it.
Yeah, yeah. I managed to find some time yesterday. I was like, working group tomorrow. I thought it was next week, but of
It's
course,
fantastic. I saw the PR last night, looked at it this morning. I was like, oh wow, this is great. It covers everything. So thank you.
awesome. I'm really happy. Thanks.
Hey everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
Alexa, stop. Sorry about that. Hey Vaughn, how have you been?
Hi, good, thanks. By the way, like as update on GraphQL HTTP working group, we currently on board like 2 new guys instead of Sam because Sam had a newborn, so he's said he don't have enough time to work on GraphQL HTTP, so on board 2 new contributors, and we decided to try to be more synchronous for GraphQL HTTP working group. Hi, Lee.
Hey everybody, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. How's everybody been recently? I see the participant list ticking up, so we'll wait a couple of minutes until we jump into the agenda.
Lee, live notes link is not up in the agenda yet.
Oh, thanks for reminding me of that. I'll get that set up. All right, I've got a live note stock up and running. It looks like our participant list is pretty stable. So let's get going. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. We've got a pretty nice agenda, actually relatively tight, so that's great. It means we should be able to spend some good time on each of the things that we have up. I'll go over the agenda overall in a moment, but at the top, first, a reminder that by all of us attending, we all agree to the membership agreement, participation guidelines, and code of conduct. Should be well known by everybody here, I think. You don't have too many folks who haven't heard that before, but just in case, there's links in the agenda if you want to go look at those. And then as per usual, we usually go around and introduce ourselves, and we can use the order that is listed in the agenda. And if you don't see yourself there, then please just send a pull request so we have a good record of who was here. And I'm off the top, so I'll introduce myself first. Hey, everybody, my name is Lee. And on to you, Benji.
Hey, sorry, I was editing the notes. Hey everyone, I'm Benji. I'm part of the, I work on the GraphQL projects, and I'm working on the tagged type RFC.
Hi everyone, my name is Mark. I work at Yelp and I'm doing GraphQL stuff over at Yelp. And I'm here to talk about the field coordinates RFC.
I think we might be missing Wojek. Antoine, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Hey, this is Antoine. I work at Netflix and doing some GraphQL and federation stuff.
I think we're missing Yuri as well right now, so I'll go next. Hi, my name is Evan. I work at Shopify, leading API patterns there.
Dan, are you here?
Yeah, sorry about that. I had to step away for a second. Dan Schaefer from Facebook.
Hi, my name is Ivan, and I'm helping with GraphQL.js, GraphQL HTTP, and some other project under GraphQL Foundation.
Hey everyone, I'm Robert from AWS.
Hey, I'm Morris from IBM, working on a GraphQL proxy and a bunch of these issues coming up.
Hey, this is Raphael. I'm working on the Green GraphQL platform. Michael is joining the meeting later. Thank you.
Anybody who wasn't on the agenda so far?
I just joined. Uri from the guild. Hi, everyone.
Welcome, Yuri. Andy, I think we missed you.
Hi everybody, it's early here. Good morning from Sydney. I'm Andy. I'm working on GraphQL Java and Atlassian.
Glad you could join. Welcome. All right, everybody. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. It looks like we already have some excellent fleshing out of the notes, thanks to our perennial note taker, Benji. Is anybody able to jump in and help out Benji, especially since many of our agenda items today are led by Benji? I think it will be worthwhile to have an additional note taker.
I can, yeah, I can try and do that.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Let's take a quick look over the agenda that we have. We are going to talk about query ambiguity, or more specifically, terminology ambiguity around the term query, the dunder type name and how it fits into subscriptions, schema coordinates, tag type and then an update from the GraphQL JS working group. That's our agenda. Anything else anybody wants to talk about while we're all here today?
I think we can just squeeze this into the next topic, but I wanted to solicit feedback on the new way that I've organized the action items.
Sweet. Well, we'll do that as part of action item discussion. Thank you for doing that. That is the next thing on here, which is let's look at action items and what needs to get done and what we have gotten done. I popped those over. Feel free to pop that link open yourself. Benji, since you mentioned that, how about you just kind of give us a quick update about what you've done here?
Yeah, so we've not been, I'll turn my video on. We've not been particularly disciplined with regard to filing the action items for the last little while. So I thought it would be quite useful not only to make sure that we've filed them, but also to keep track of where they've come from. And that way we can sort of see the progress of each individual meeting's action items. And hopefully we'll see that the older items over time will get closed. So I've used the GitHub projects feature. I've created one for every meeting, and I've added each of the items to that. We have the action items label, which we apply to all of those, so we can easily filter them out. And then the idea is that when someone thinks that their item is ready for, ready to be closed, I've created the ready for review label that we can apply to it. I believe the intention, certainly from the template, is that the items will get closed during the working group meetings. So I think that gives us an easier way of flagging the ones that we think are ready to be closed. And broadly, yeah, I've gone through and I've filed a whole load of the old ones. Some of them, I'm afraid, contain multiple to-dos because there was a lot to catch up on. And many of them are probably already worthy of being closed. So this might be a lot of closing going on during this call. But yeah, I just wanted to get us into a state where the last 5 months had already been entered.
That's excellent. Thank you for doing that. I'm also catching up on the work that you did because since I know you created a lot of these in the last day and certainly the last couple of weeks. But let's pop through some of these. Which of these do we think we can close out quickly? And maybe it'll be helpful if I just share my screen really quick. Or share one of these Google tabs, if it will let me. That's what we want. Okay, this first one, Benji, this one is on you. You said this is completed?
Yeah. So this was from months ago, and we raised the tag type RFC since then.
Great. So since these, I'm going to filter these down to what are marked ready for review based on your suggestion. So presumably these are the ones we can first work through and close out, and then we can go back and see if there's any follow-ups or updates we want to solicit.
Yep.
So this one is good. Clarify the problem that field coordinates is addressing. And
this is what I'm here to discuss.
All right. Sounds like you have made good on this follow-up and we're going to talk about it today. So I'm going to call this one good. Create issues for action items for previous calls. Meta, good. And discuss flow support in the TypeScript version of GraphQL JS. And any quick update on how we want to think about this one? This was reopened.
Yeah, so like I make a comment and close it because I forget about flow that we should discuss it on working group before closing. So update on this on GraphQL JS working group call, and we will tell details later. But about this question, so my main concern was that we don't have I like don't have enough resources, enough time to support flow typings. But since Dotan and Uri is volunteer to help with maintaining flow typings, so issue resolved itself. So basically, I think it can be
Sweet.
closed.
All right. We will close all of these issues. Here, let me just do this the easy way. Oh, wait, can I mark all these closed this way? Yep. Okay. Mark is closed. Something went wrong. Come on, GitHub. All right. If we go back here and pull these down to action items, these are in a little bit squirrely order just because of the way that they are created.
You might want to narrow them down to the ones that are assigned to you, Lee, because many of them are like read over this, that, and the other, which I think you've done. You tend to be quite quick with those.
Read over the GraphQL custom scalar PR. I'm going to leave this open because I want to go back and I want to only call this one done once I've actually advanced this and merged it. So I'm going to leave that open and get to that later today.
I think that's duplicate of 424 down at the bottom as well.
Yeah, it is. And that one actually is done because the editorial pass was completed. So slightly different. But this last one is a final pass before we merge, which I think you brought up a comment on earlier, which is great. And I'll go bottom to the top since these are older. Vision for the code page. Yeah, that one's definitely still on me. That one's open. I don't know how where the priority of that one is relative to these other ones. Checkbox to issue template to confirm agreements are signed. I think we're going to replace this with an automated script. So we should start seeing Brian Warner's magic bot show up and require that people have signed paperwork. The reason why you probably haven't seen it is because he has done the good front work of making sure if you've already signed such an agreement that you won't be bothered by the bot. So I think that one is good. And license is missing in the scalars subproject. I think I still need to go fix this. So this one is still open, and I think we still have to figure out exactly how we want to do the legal framework. Brian was looking into if what I had proposed actually made sense. So I'm going to leave that one open. I'm talking to Brian later today, and I can bring that up. PR merging policy that grants more contributors access to the working group repo. I think we have that policy figured out, but I need to add the more maintainers. So that piece is still on me. And moving the deprecated directive on input fields RFC to stage 2. I think I missed getting this done, but this is ready to go.
It's like, it's partly on me, so it's not partly ready to go. So
right.
PR is merged into GraphQL.js, not released yet because we blocked on some like TypeScript issue, and it's like Dotan is volunteering to help with this issue, so we will resolve and publish with change in GraphQL.js. But for spec, we're still missing. I still need to add like a node rule for requiring that deprecated field is optional. So it's not there yet. So yeah, right. Actually, like I tried to promote it to draft 2 today, but like later I reread it and like so I move it back because I remember that I forget to add this line. It's like I will do it today because it's like one or 2 sentences to spec.
Cool.
And Benja volunteered to proofread it. So I think we're good.
I'll
with this.
temporarily remove myself as an assignee until you see that piece done. If I'm thrilled to hear that Dotan's volunteering to help get that done. That's awesome. And once we do that, then I'll move it forward to 2.
I lost audio for a moment there. This one probably needs splitting up into multiple different actions. So I can do that if that's useful.
Cool. Yeah, I think specifically the GraphQL JS piece is the blocker to RFC2.
So as a note, because probably I confuse you. So it's already merged into GraphQL.js. It's just not released yet because of other issue that working release. So it's merged but not released. So that's why we don't get any feedback on it. So, but it's in master, and .env helping.
Okay. I misunderstood. That's great. So it's in. It's just a matter of waiting for the release to go out. I'm comfortable with that. We can advance the stage, and it can sit in stage 2 while we go through that collection process, feedback collection process. Sweet. Mark as closed. Something went wrong again. Come on, GitHub. Cool. GitHub won't let me close issues today. Oh, it's because they're already closed? Sure.
It takes time. It doesn't refresh the UI always. I'm used to
it. Great. Maybe we can get some people calling in from GitHub every once in a while so they can watch us use the tool in frustration.
I'd love to get Robert Masalgo on this call at one point because they are also a big GraphQL user and have some opinions.
Yes, they are.
We talk about.
Great point. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see each other while we talk through the rest of the issues. Thanks again, Benji, for organizing that. That was much smoother than previous meetings. I love that organization scheme. Okay, and with that, we'll go on to our next agenda item, which is yours to drive, Benji.
Okay, yes. So query ambiguity, right? So we mentioned this in a working group meeting a little while ago, and it turns out, just want to make sure, can everyone hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Good, because I had audio issues just now. Linux, hooray. So there's an issue that a lot of people new to GraphQL find, and especially it's hard when you're trying to write documentation for something, that the term query can be used in many different ways. It can be used with regard to fetching data, with regard to finding out information about a thing, with regard to the query type itself, with regard to the query operation, and many other things. So what I've done is I've gone through the entire GraphQL spec, looked for every word, query, queries, queried that has been used anywhere, and I've tried to put them into buckets based on the meanings that I feel that they have. And then I've tried to come up with good names for those buckets using terms that are generally already used in the GraphQL spec, perhaps in the more technical parts of the spec, for example, the actual code, not code, but the, what do you call them, Lee? The code racy bits.
Selection set?
No, the in specmd, the like referenced code like parts of the spec.
Oh, I don't remember if I had a term for that. I know what you're talking about though.
But those, yes. So I've outlined in pull request 777, I've actually gone through and made these edits to the spec. I'm not expecting these to be merged as is. It's more so that we can see these changes actually in context. And in a lot of cases, as I note in this pull request, where I've been in doubt whether I should make the edit or not, I've gone ahead and made the edit because we can always go, it's easier to go back and be consistent that way rather than to then try and find all the places again. So in a lot of the GraphQL spec, we talk about queries where generally what we're saying applies actually to all of the operations, queries, mutations, subscriptions, and potentially future operations. So in a lot of places, we've changed query to operation, or I've changed. And And yeah, I guess I could go through the terms that I've introduced, or I'm not sure what the best way of surfacing what I've done here is for discussion.
There's an interesting trade-off at play, right? Like query is a overloaded term within the context of the spec, to your point, and that's exactly why it's worthwhile to do this. But at the same time, it has this sort of common understanding beyond the context of GraphQL of that it's also overloaded in that sense. But I don't know how to tease that apart, you know, like query can sometimes mean the text of a thing. It can sometimes mean a particular, like a read versus a write. But in the general way, people know it to mean a request, kind of, you know, an ask. And I don't know exactly how to grapple with that just yet, that making the terminology here more crisp is definitely a good thing. But at the same time, for a new reader, especially in this like section 1, which is an overview, and then in other parts of the spec that are a bit more non-normative and more describing why something is important rather than what it is, those feel like they've taken a legibility hit. And maybe that's just a matter of like exactly how we want to tune this, but I'm sort of curious to hear your perspective as you're going through this. I presume you kind of noticed a similar thing, and how you've been thinking about that.
Yeah, I think it's very natural to talk in terms of query, and then you can say things like query reuse without having to really define exactly what it is that you're talking about, and it makes the text easy to parse, but potentially harder to actually understand. Because when you start to then think about it, it's not, unless you're already familiar with GraphQL, it's not always clear what specifically that term query means. Does it mean fetch? Does it mean issue a request to your server? Does it mean introspect this particular thing and interrogate it, and various other things? So I definitely agree. And as I mentioned, I've gone too far deliberately in the modifications of it. But partly what I would like is for us to come up with a glossary that we can then use for these terms in the more precise parts of the spec. And also in the wider ecosystem, people are referring to, for example, the fields at the root level of the query type as queries. There is like the word query beyond the spec is overloaded like everywhere. As you comment, it's useful outside of GraphQL. You can think of it as just it is just a normal English word that is used in many places. And I think if we can come up with a way of reducing that ambiguity without necessarily going quite as far as I've gone in this pull request, I think that would definitely be beneficial.
So a few things come to mind to me that seem relatively uncontroversial. I think anywhere that we are referring to like a literal query, as in we mean specifically the query operation type, I feel like we're fairly inconsistent in whether we surround it with backticks or not. And I think in places where it's like, okay, in the query, when you use this particular operation name, that's something to say, hey, we are not using this in the colloquial term. Like if you look at the code block above this or below this, you will see query as a keyword. We're referring to query as a keyword. I feel like there were a couple of spots there that I looked and went, oh yeah, this makes sense. A lot of the time, I think when I was reading through the changes, I went, we're replacing query with operation. And that is technically correct, because the thing that we were describing, it could have been a mutation, or it could have been a subscription, or it could have been another operation. And maybe this is just my sort of internal bias and how I've seen it used, but it's usually a query. And I colloquially am just like, yeah, it's probably a query. And I almost wonder if a non-normative note of just being like, there will be times when we will refer to an operation as a query. And like, it just explicitly say like, if we mean only queries and not mutations and not subscriptions, we'll say so. But if we're like, yeah, if you were querying a server and asked for, me first name, you would expect to get something back in, the me first name shape. That flows to me in a way that like, I actually think changing from the word query, I don't know, like the places where we're using it in just like normal English. Oh yeah, if you query a server, I'm like, yeah, okay. If you send a request to the server, does no harm. I think the operation is the big one. And maybe that's just because operation has never quite resonated with me as the term here. It's just become the term of art.
And one other thing I'll add is that in our like own internal documentation, to like account for this ambiguity, we also use the term documents, because I think I've seen that used quite a lot in various official documentation places to mean like the request payload, the text that the client sends to the server. And obviously a document can contain like, well, many operations, I guess. So that might be another like aspect of this.
Yeah. What Dan said kind of was where I was thinking of going as well, of just like, because the ambiguity is not just within the spec, right? The ambiguity is within English as a language and kind of the way people tend to use that outside of GraphQL as well. I was also thinking of like, there's room for us to leave a non-normative note saying like, this is a confusing English word. You know, we've used it in this way, but other people will use it in other ways. And that's like just something to be aware of as you read the spec. That said, I do think because the spec is a technical document, I would prefer that we pick specific words with specific meanings and you know, define those up front, even if it's a little harder to parse in English, rather than saying, we're just going to use query for everything because that's what the word people know. Clarity trumps accessibility for a technical document, in my opinion.
I'm with you. The part of the spirit of this particular technical document is that we hope that it is accessible. We've put in a lot of work to make sure that the English is not super dense and that there's a lot of explanation along the way so that a non-super technical person could kind of start at the top and read it and make sense of it in a way that a lot of the other RFCs that I've read have been much, much more difficult to parse. But the spirit of what you're saying, I completely agree with. Being crisp with language is super important, especially in the cases where we're actually describing something, right? Where we're explaining how something works, then ambiguity in that case can be actually really damaging. In places where we're speaking in a high level way, then I think it's okay to kind of lean back on the, you know, the general kind of concept of a query is a little bit of an overloaded term. And in some of these places where we're replacing a word, we could, especially if it's right on top of an example where we're literally just describing the example you're about to read, we can, you know, if we want to replace the word query with the word document or operation or whatever, we can say in parens or something in this example, a query, because it literally is like, it's technically, yes, it's an operation, but like the example is showing you a query. But that might also be, Benji, to your point about kind of going too far and pulling it back, where sometimes when we say query, we literally mean a query operation. And that's the example that's sitting right in front of you as a query operation. And that could be okay. And I appreciate the strategy that you're taking here of just like pushing it to the extreme and seeing where it feels bad and then scaling it back. I think that's pretty wise.
Yeah, one of the things I'd be curious about is a little bit this is sort of the what if we replace everything. What is the version that is, for lack of a better term, the non-controversial version, where it's just like, yeah, you know, this is just clearly clearly ambiguous right now. It's just like in the following query, and the, you know, example below it is a mutation, and it's like, okay, cool, like this is clearly creating confusion. And I wonder if there's sort of like, there's clearly going to be a spectrum here of like some of these changes we're just going to look into, yes, this is clearly better prose. And on some of them, it's like, oh shoot, like now we use operation 3 times right before we describe a query. Is that can be confusing? And like almost just like, for lack of a better term, land the uncontroversial ones or the ones that you suspect to be uncontroversial, and then we can iterate from there. I think the other thing I would consider is, are there places where we can make the current text that is ambiguous but reads smoothly unambiguous by changing the examples around it? Where, for example, if we say, you know, hey, in the following query, and it's a unmarked query where it's just a selection set that I guess could have been a query, literally just add the query keyword. And it's like, okay, now this is a query instead of a selection set. so that when we say in the following query, it's actually accurate. That might be another way of making the prose unambiguous while also making the prose still flow in whatever sort of like prosy way it works right now.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. I certainly like the idea of pulling certain classes of changes out of here that are non-controversial, getting them merged separately, rebasing, and then seeing what the next round is if there is another one. One of the things that I really would like to achieve with this is where the spec states things about queries, which happens a lot. So like, for example, it says something like, a GraphQL query, on the other hand, returns exactly what a client asked for and no more. Like, yes, that is true. But also, that is true of all operations. It's not only true of queries. And potentially putting the word query there makes it seem like, okay, so for queries, this is true, but maybe mutations and subscriptions work in a different way. And maybe it will for a future operation, we don't know. But there's also things like GraphQL query execution may choose to only include, sorry, I'm reading the wrong bit. I've lost the bit that I was looking at. But yeah, so there's bits where it says things about queries and it uses the term query, which would be interpreted in the sense of the query operation, where actually the text applies to all operations, and it effectively leaves those other operations undefined at that point. And many times that is actually resolved as part of the more code-like parts of the spec. But the prose itself does leave that ambiguity in there where you're like, well, okay, if that works for queries, what is the rule for mutations? And that, as much as anything, is one of the things I'd like to remove. As you say, it's a technical document, so it should be being precise.
Evan, can you go into more detail about the ambiguity that led to query.query.query.query.query? Because that to me is, wherever that ambiguity is, that actually feels like the one that is very clear. I mean, as you mentioned, very clearly not prose and very clearly something that is, you know, misunderstood or overridden in people's minds.
Yeah, give me 30 seconds to dig up where that is actually happening and make sure I remember which ones we got mixed up there.
Can I say in the meantime that, sorry, can I say in the meantime that the worst ambiguity comes actually not from the spec, but from the variables in the JSON payload we're sending over HTTP, in my experience. Like, nobody really reads the spec in the way we are doing. But if you look at the HTTP request we're sending and the query contains mutation, subscription, or actually query, and this causes a lot of confusion if you talk with people, in my experience. So it's definitely overloaded.
Yeah. We've discussed that quite a lot as part of graphical working group and the GraphQL over HTTP working group as well. It's a common issue. And really it should be operation, because we already have operation name in there. It would make sense, or even document. It probably actually
I think document is probably the term that best describes it, because a document could contain multiple operations.
Yeah, exactly.
I do think there's a question of like, I don't know that it becomes more clear to somebody looking at it across the first time. It's like, oh, GraphQL, what do I send to the server? A document. Huh, a document? Like there is almost a inherent contradiction of like, if you have used GraphQL for a while and it's like, oh yeah, I can send a document, it can contain multiple operations and I can select the operation. But if you're doing the hello world, get me name, you do send a query to the server. And I mean, in some ways that is both like, there's a little bit of post hoc ergo propter hoc. That's also why it's named query, because originally you didn't have the ability to send mutations because mutations didn't exist. Like the derivation of how we got there, I think is relevant in that it tells us how we got there and therefore the things that we should revisit and change. But it also tells us the things that we thought, okay, this is what's going to make this most clear to somebody who's never seen GraphQL before. And one of the, like, you know, prior history for prior history's sake is no valid prior history, because that is actually the way that you need to dip someone's feet into GraphQL might have some benefit.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And for a long time, I thought basically we have no choice in that matter. You know, it's called query. It's always been called query. if we change the name of it, then it's going to break GraphQL servers and such. One interesting point we have coming up is potentially if we get to a point where we can release the version 1 of the GraphQL over HTTP spec, and we start requiring the content type headers and things like that that currently are either ignored or optional. We could at that point introduce this, and we can always do it so that like if we receive query, we'll just rewrite it transparently to be document, for example, which would be cheap.
Yeah, there's something that's nice about the ability to understand it quickly. You send a query, you get a response. There's just two terms there. And even though in practice, what you're really doing is you're sending a request, which contains a document, which contains operations, one of which is a query, which then returns a response. It's like, that's technically what's happening there, but most people don't really care that there's like a thing that's parsing their file and turning it into some intermediate representation along which there are these terminologies. The most common happy path is I send you a query and you send me a response. And there's something really nice about framing up the actual tools that people use in that way. So I think it could make sense that you know, we're getting a little bit off the charted path here, but for GraphQL HTTP to keep query around, just even for that kind of early education path to help people understand what's going on here, because it's easy to describe. And that might be kind of back to my very first point, kind of what I'm getting at, that kind of query is easy to understand in context if you are already familiar with the usage of the term in a way that document, operation, and request are not. And even within, I think you've made almost all correct suggestions here, even though you've kind of pushed it to the extreme and we can peel it back. But as I sort of read through the actual like recommendations that you have on what we swap out, I'm realizing that there's a lot of places where you would recommend we use the word operation, where I would think like, is operation the right term there? Would we use document? Would we use request? And it actually it's like I find myself kind of getting lost in those three particular terms about what's most appropriate in the moment, because it's not that it's unambiguous. It's like irrelevant, right? Like when you say, oh, this applies to an operation versus this applies to a document, it's like both of those actually could be true in a particular circumstance. And how do we want to describe it in those moments?
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't actually easy to edit because it did take time thinking through which of these does this actually apply to, and really which concept does this belong to. And yeah, I did put time into that. I'm trying to make sure it was the right decision each time. And I think you raise a good point that sometimes it doesn't matter. Like if it applies to a document, then it applies to a request because a request contains a document. If it applies to the query type, then it applies to all these things because all of them may well boil down to the query type. But again, I think it's where maybe precision is useful in that case, because if you're implementing GraphQL, when you read the spec, you want to know which part of your implementation you care about this particular sentence for. And that may be relevant. Maybe not in all the places I've done it, obviously, but certainly in a few. Okay, so next, sorry, did someone else want to say something?
This is like a potentially like dumb, I don't know, not valuable thing, but I was just like thinking through like there's parallels here in other domains, right? So you send an HTTP request and you could send like a get method or a post method, right? So maybe there's some value in kind of looking at what like other specs do. So like looking at the HTTP spec, like whenever it talks about like a request, it always talks about a get request, and that's like a standard that they have in the HTTP spec almost. So it's always unambiguous. Like it never just talks about like a request. It's always a get request to kind of reduce the ambiguity there. So I don't know if there's any yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but yeah, could take
I think it is
some
quite
inspiration.
helpful. And it actually reflects one of the things that I've done in this, which is that query as a standalone word, I've not really allowed to exist. So when you actually refer to a query, it would always say, for example, query operation. And I think what that means is if we don't then follow the word query with operation or document or variables or whatever else, then it can be then, you know, if query exists on its own, then it's being used as a broad generic term. Whereas if it is query operation, then it is well defined. And I think we can do that quite cleanly. We don't need a naked query like in any of the technical aspects of the spec in the way that I've defined the terms currently. So I think there's two things I'd like to get out of this. The first thing is broadly the definitions that I've come up with, like the glossary. I'd like to get feedback on that, make sure that people are happy with that. And that doesn't need to be during this call, like by all means, follow up afterwards. And then I guess the next action would be if everyone's happy with the definitions that I've got, it would be putting a few of these edits into the spec. So pulling out maybe what I feel are the most painful areas right now, or the least controversial, and pulling those into a pull request that we can review in future. There is another separate question, which is, should we look at actually adding a glossary? And if so, for now, should that just be like a markdown file in the repo that is separate from the spec whilst we build up the terminology? Or what's the best approach there, if we even need one?
I feel like a glossary should be an inherent part of the spec.md document, in the same way that, like, there already is an appendix to the spec that describes all of the grammar rules, all of the algorithm rules, and it would make sense that every time like a term is defined, that has like a first class thing. That way the tool can kind of automatically help us manage that, and they can be linked, which would be nice. So when you see a word and it's linked, you know that it isn't just like a colloquial use of the word, it's actually referred to as some definition that exists in the document. That's not a thing that I expect you to do in this particular edit, but I think that could be the right sort of like long-term direction for a glossary to take.
Yeah, I think like to Dan's earlier point of like, what's the non-controversial version of this pull request? I think the non-controversial pull version is a glossary and a non-normative note that query is really confusing. And like, that's the thing that's like, just will help people already reading the spec and working with it, but doesn't change the language or, you know, open any of those other questions.
I think even before then, just, you know, I just kind of reading through the changes, a bunch of them I don't pan out and in part of this like first uncontroversial change, but a handful of them definitely do. There's where you add in you don't replace a term, you add a word just to make the phrase more clear. Like those should be non-controversial. The place where we say query and we're actually just wrong, that it's like we're talking about something specific in a way that query is super confusing. That's like maybe 20% of this pull request, but there's definitely a handful of the changes in here that are going to be really non-controversial that might help kind of tease down what these definitions are. So I feel like that could be factored out independently. That would be very easy to review. Then this non-normative note, I think the idea of it is non-controversial. Exactly how we frame it might be, but you should take a stab at it. I think that will be really useful. I'd love to have a version of it that actually allows us to use the word query sort of without any additional words around it within the document. I think that was that Evan, was that your point or was that Dan's point of when you see the word query in this doc, here's how to interpret it. Like, we understand that this word is a little bit of an overloaded term. You know, when we say query, we might be referring to a couple of things, but usually we're referring to a query operation. And then that way, like a lot of these changes are just, there's an example below. That example happens to be a query. And we say, this query is whatever, or in this example query. And like that seems fine to me. Like it doesn't seem ambiguous that we point to a example, which is itself a query, and say that it's a query. You know, technically we could be more specific, but we're kind of introducing an example that doesn't, I think that could be fine. And if we have a non-normative note that makes that kind of clear, so when someone wants to get pedantic on us, they go, when you said query here, do you mean all things? It's like, no, we're usually describing an example when we use that term. And then I think that might be the right framing of it, but open to other thoughts and ideas.
One note that I have is that with GraphQL.js and other implementations, people usually open bugs or they implement the PRs based on the part of the spec. So they're not reading from start to the finish. They're just reading the relevant part. So they will basically miss the normative node on the query. Especially since like with citation feature, I really like it and it's very useful. So like people citate stuff. And so like, I think it's better when parts of a spec are self-contained. I agree about examples, maybe they're like more illustrative in a sense, but like algorithms and things should be citatable. So you should like just do part of a spec without any normative node up top in different section and just like put it in an issue. And yeah, and second point is that as non-native speaker, it's like it's a little bit confusing. Always different type of queries. So like I personally, like from my point, it's easy to have like document operation and query is a type of operation because it's like less confusing when you're reading text in foreign language.
Yeah, agreed. Anything that is normative, especially an algorithm, the terminology there should be very crisp. Cool. So Benji, it sounds like you have some thoughts on next steps, and you're also asking for people to drop comments with more specific feedback in your issue or pull request.
Yes, please. I want to make sure that the terms that I would do any further edits with are the correct terms. And then also with regard to the glossary, I think obviously a glossary is a significant undertaking because it doesn't just relate to this one word, it relates to lots of words. So yeah, absolutely. I think it should be an appendix if and when we add it in future. But in the meantime, I think we can probably start building up a glossary. So maybe it would make sense to have a markdown file somewhere that we can add to. And then when it's ready, we can just move it into the spec folder. Does that seem like a reasonable approach?
Sounds reasonable to me.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, let's keep things moving. And the next agenda item is also yours, Benji, talking about type names under subscriptions.
So this was an interesting one. Whilst I was going through doing the previous stuff, I was reading through the document in quite good detail and realized that type name was talked about, and realized that if you're doing a subscribe operation with the GraphQL reference implementation, so GraphQL.js, and you do a subscription to the __ type name field, you get an error because it doesn't return an async iterable. Now, obviously, doing this doesn't really make sense. This isn't a thing that returns, it's not a real-time piece of information. But also getting an error back maybe doesn't feel like the right thing to do here. So I'm not sure whether we just say, this is an edge case, no one's going to do this, we don't care, or whether we ought to put some wording here, or whether honestly, I don't know what the right thing is to do here. I just noticed it and it seemed like it wasn't right.
So it just happens if you just do the underline type name, right? Because otherwise it would raise an exception that you're only allowed to specify one subscription field. So it's
exactly correct.
Validation rule.
I'm honestly, I think that might be a reasonable thing. One thing to keep in mind, which is quite interesting, if you send a regular GraphQL resolve to, so an execute to the subscription type for that field, it will resolve and it will give you the right thing. So it's only actually the subscribe and not the execute that causes this issue. So it's not technically that that field can't exist on the subscription type, it's that it cannot be subscribed to. So yeah, even more edge casey.
But you must be looking for this kind of error. And it is really an edge case, but a validation rule might be the right thing to do here and just prohibit it, because there's no value in subscribing to a type name.
Yeah, or just leave it as is and put a non-normative note in the spec saying, if someone does this, it'll throw an error. Doesn't matter, like they're not doing something sensible. I just don't want it to look like an oversight.
This one is tricky. I feel like anything we do, I mean, you've found one of the rare logical inconsistencies across the spec. It's like you can't fix a logical inconsistency with an additional rule. You just move the logical inconsistency, right? So there's another rule somewhere that says any selection set you're always allowed to ask for dunder type name. And so then we break that one by saying in this particular case, there's a validation rule that fails. So then that one is broken. And like how broadly would we like to spread this particular edge case across the spec in terms of managing it? So I don't know what the right answer is. I don't have a strong opinion, but leaving it be might be the most reasonable thing, or having a small note specific to subscriptions that this might not be a reasonable thing that works. Open to ideas though.
I actually feel like we should support type name because we have this property that on every level you can figure out what type is, and in some cases, like for schema-less clients, they actually do some useful things like normalization and stuff. Obviously, you should not cache like top level subscription and normalize it, but basically we add one additional rule in every client, saying like you should inject type name. So Apollo, for example, injecting type name, and like we say on subscription you should not inject type name on top level. I feel like right now we're pushing corner case into clients instead of addressing it. And what I propose, can we allow like we have rules that subscription can contain only single field. What if we allow it to be a single non-introspection field and as much introspection fields you want? So like you can do any number of introspection fields.
But how would you do that actually? Like if you are you just referring to underline type name, or would you also allow like asking for the whole introspection?
No, like other introspections fields accessible, like schema and type accessible only on query. But in future, if we add something that accessible from subscription, like some other thing, So basically we can say like, for right now, for practice purpose, you should put something beyond introspection field. You cannot just send underscore type name. But if you put something that is not underscore type name, you can also put underscore type name in addition to that. So we don't add something new, we just change our existing validation rule. I don't think we should regulate introspection fields the same way we regulate like normal fields.
While that would be okay, I think the initial issue is still what do we do with underline type name? You could just automatically open up like a stream that has just one item and then is finished, like consumed after you consumed the type name. That would be one way to deal it. But I think that's the
yeah, we can change a spec requiring subscription to contain one non-introspection field, so one user like field. So you need to put something. You cannot just put underscore type name, so it will be a validation error. But you can put something plus underscore type name.
Okay, I understand. You want to change the current validation rule, not introduce a new one to just say, okay, there has to be a subscription field, but there can also be the underline type name. Yeah, that could.
Alternatively, like another solution could be just to ban, like we already know that subscription with just dunder type name doesn't work. Like it returns an error in the reference implementation and probably in other implementations. I haven't checked them. So we could just say that the validation for the subscription operation is that it must have one field and that field cannot be an introspection field. That is already the status quo. That is already what all useful subscriptions do. So though it is technically a breaking change, it's not really. Like no one is sensibly requesting dunder type name there. And I think that would probably just solve it. Like in a subscription request, you may only have one field and that field is not an introspection field. To Ivan's point, there actually was an issue. I forget whether it was from GraphQL itself or whether it was from GraphQL Explorer from the OneGraph guys. But there was an issue where the dunder type name was being added to subscriptions like accidentally and was causing subscriptions to break. And that was something that someone had to fix at some point. So Ivan's point that he raises is actually like it is an issue that has been faced in the GraphQL ecosystem. But I'm not necessarily like, I think it's okay to say there's this one place where you can't add dunder type name and it is specifically an operation rather than a generic selection set. It's an operation selection set on the subscription operation.
The spec actually already calls out that introspection fields are counted in the rule that only one entry must exist in the top level selection set of a subscription. And there's an example that shows some subscription has a new message field and then also type name, and that's a counterexample that fails. And so that's the scenario that you're talking about, right? That type name field was getting added automatically and was therefore causing a problem.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
So I feel like no option is a great option, but maybe there's an acceptable option. And Benji, what you're describing, I'm kind of on board with.
That's great because that's actually what the PR is.
Amazing, great work. I'm also with Ivan that getting this introspection ability everywhere is actually really important. So I don't want to take it lightly if we kind of officially block that here. And I kind of want to better understand the implications of doing that. And maybe it's okay. But certainly type name on its own, that just, I don't think that ever makes sense. Like that would require so much additional mechanics to, like, you don't have a subscription source. So like, what is the subscription supposed to do? And is that even a reasonable use case to subscribe only to the type name of the top level of the subscription? That's probably not a useful thing. And so since there isn't a use there, then maybe it's okay if introspection at that very top level for subscription goes away. But I don't know, can anybody else think of any other reason why this could really hurt us in the long run?
Well, it already doesn't work. So I don't think we're really sacrificing anything.
That's a great point. If we expand from any other introspection fields at the top level, we'll have to make sure that our memory is good and we come back to this issue and make sure that whatever we're expanding works for subscriptions. But that's pretty theoretical. So I think I'm on board with your proposal here. Any other dissenting opinions?
No, not dissenting opinions, but just as an idea, Benji, could you open an issue and basically close it directly again inside the repo to make it searchable? If you have not already, you know, kind of document our thoughts in this way.
Sorry, Andy. So I've opened a pull request for this with the spec edits. Are you talking about maybe including a copy of this discussion in the issue, in the pull request itself?
No, I understood that we don't want to do anything about it, right? Or did I miss? Or did I get this wrong? About the underscore type name problem and subscriptions, we want to open a pull request or we don't?
I think that the conclusion we've come to is that the pull request that I've raised, which basically says that there is a single exception of the subscription root operation type to where dunder type name is valid. I think we're proposing that that might be worth merging because nothing currently works with it anyway. It doesn't seem to have any penalty. It's just like an artifact that a loophole that we can close without pain, I think. It might be that I need to do some more spec edits to actually make that mergeable, but broadly that's the proposal, I think, currently.
Okay, sorry, then I misunderstood you. Then go ahead, forget what I said.
Yeah, I think you can certainly clean up the pull requests to kind of factor in what we've discussed, but you can keep everything in that one. And we can mark that as a proposal since it'll actually result in a spec change. I do think that the right move forward is actually changing that validation rule and keeping the logic specific to the subscriptions. There's like a subscriptions validation piece. That's the right place to do that.
Yeah, sounds great. So I'll add that to that pull request.
I have a question about allowing type name in addition to. So like I agree, it's separate. It's totally separate issue in a sense because it's not addressing like initial concern. So I'm just asking if somebody volunteers to do that with proposal. Is it something that people are interested in, or it's like purely theoretical? Because I feel like from time to time, everybody, every like advanced client that inject type name will go through this issue of discovering this problem and fixing it and adding one more like thing into source code. Is it these people interested in having it separate PR, not to block bunches PRs that address actual problem?
Cool. I think we can follow up with additional feedback on the pull request. Okay, moving on. Schema coordinates check-in. Mark, I'll hand it to you.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I'll hand back over to Benji then for notes for this, if that's okay. So yeah, I talked about this 2 meetings ago, and we had a good discussion over this. Just a like super quick reminder for folks. So the schema coordinates, formerly field coordinates, RFC, is sort of canonicizing this thing that we already do in a bunch of places, which is to refer to the name attributes of a user object as user.name. And that's useful in a bunch of places and a bunch of tooling to be able to kind of like, be able to describe it in that way. So I have a RFC for this. I guess I should put the link in there. But last time we discussed this, the action item was to crisp up the problem statements and to sort of concretely talk about what the use cases are. So I think I've done that. So I would appreciate kind of feedback on that. Hopefully we're in a place where this is like non-controversial. And so I think the action item now is for me to turn that into a like actual spec edit. The algorithm, or whatever we want to call it, is kind of described in the PR already through examples, but I think turning that into a like formal spec thing is where I'm struggling a little bit. So I've been like trying to do that, like deciding, okay, should this be like a new like markdown file in the spec? We have like a couple of appendix files. So is there going to be like a new appendix file for like non core execution notes or conventions or something like that? Yeah, so this is mostly to kind of like let you know that I'm still alive and thinking about this, and also just like voicing the I don't really know how to turn this into a like proper, like I don't know where to put this in the spec, basically. So yeah, just kind of checking in, and yeah, I want to talk about it.
It is an interesting question of where such a thing goes once we agree on it. Because the spec's purpose is to kind of describe what is and what isn't GraphQL. And this doesn't really help us do that. And so that's probably part of the reason why you struggled a bit to try to figure out where to put it. I could see it going in an appendix that just kind of like describes schema coordinates and how to refer to them. It could also be folded in sort of as we introduce these concepts of like how to find them. The other place that it might be relevant is where we talk about errors. So especially since one of the early motivations here is when you have machine generated errors that want to be able to refer back to particular places within the schema. That might be a worthwhile place to introduce this idea. Those are just ideas. I don't know if any of them are perfect though.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think I personally like the idea of the appendix section the most, just because, I mean, the errors thing makes sense, but then there's also like equally strong use cases of like GraphQL IDEs, like GraphQL and Apollo and stuff, where you like hover over the thing and it shows you in the hyperlink the schema coordinates. So then it's like, okay, do we do it in like the errors section of the spec or somewhere else? And maybe like we have it as an appendix thing and like we link to it from the errors section, if you see what I mean. So I think, I mean, look, I can just get going on that, and then like if it's the wrong place in the PR, someone can tell me to move it, and I'll do that, I guess. So I guess I'll forge ahead with that. There were a couple of like open questions. One was, what do we do about enums, which is something I had like totally not considered. But I think the suggestion in there is just like make it the same as like field attributes. So you can just do like, foo.bar, same as you would with a type and field. So I think the approach here is going to be like as exactly as you would expect. I don't think there's anything to like, and maybe I'm missing something, but it seems like relatively straightforward. Yeah.
My only thought was whether you want to make it obvious that you're looking at an enum versus looking at a field with a type, but I feel like you already faced that problem with input objects versus types having the same dot syntax. So maybe it's fine that this continues to overload that.
Yeah, I don't believe you can. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you have like an identifier as an enum, so like user could be an enum, you couldn't also have like a user type that would clash, or could you?
Correct. Yeah, all types within a schema need to have a unique name, regardless of what kind of type they are. I just meant that if you are looking at one of these schema coordinates, is it valuable to know, like if you see direction.north, it's not immediately obvious that direction is an enum and north is one of the potential values versus direction is a type and north is a field on that type, or direction is an input object and north is one of the input fields on the input object. I think it's just a trade-off, and maybe this is the right decision, but I wanted to make sure you kind of had an opinion that this is the right thing to keep it, because the benefit of what you're proposing is that it looks pretty similar to what people are probably familiar with in languages like TypeScript and Swift, and like probably the domain in which someone will be if they're on the consuming side of these.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's definitely like a great point. I think the fact that it resolves to an unambiguous thing is good, and that makes this okay. I guess it would be nice to be able to like visually see, oh, this is an enum, not a type.
If it was ambiguous, then we'd have a bigger problem. At least it's not that.
Yeah. So I don't know, like it seems like the right move, but I'd love kind of other opinions or discussions in the PR, I guess. Yeah.
For what it's worth, I think it's probably the right move. My thought was like, I saw your section on separators and colons or hashes or something like that, and was thinking like, oh yeah, maybe you would use a colon for one of these and a dot for another, and you could then tell, oh, that's an enum and that's not because of the separator. But like, is that too fiddly? Are people going to be confused by that?
Yeah, that was, I was going to say like literally that. Yeah, I agree.
One thing that might be helpful as you're continuing to evolve this is just to literally list out all of the possible types, and like, especially if this is if you're thinking like, what is the form of this that would fit as a section or as an appendix? It probably is like, for a type, here's how you describe it. For a field, here's how you describe it. For an enum, here's how you describe it. And it's just like a mapping for every possible type or every possible kind of thing that a schema coordinate would point to, and then how it's described, to avoid that case where you, even if there's one you're like, you can't describe this one, if there are cases where you can't describe them, like a union, like it would be interesting to just like touch on unions and say like, you can refer to the name of a union, but it doesn't make sense to refer to a member of a union with a schema coordinate. So like, that's not a thing that is done here. Just so that you are clear about what does have a schema coordinate and what doesn't. And then hopefully that helps you avoid additional follow-ups like this enum value that was just kind of off your radar and showed up. That luckily the suggestion here is clear, but we would want to make sure that there's no other sort of missing pieces to it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So enumerate all the different like use cases that you could have for this, all the different things you could select, and show an example for that. That makes total sense. And one other thing I wanted to call out, which is kind of like a non-goal of this, something I'm not doing, which was discussed, which is the idea of like wildcards and this kind of like wider, more generalized like selection language, like, you know, document.query select or that kind of thing. But for GraphQL, that's something that this is not, but kind of don't want to close the door to that if someone wants to build that spec in the future, maybe, I don't know, but that's just like something bubbling through my brain.
Probably smart.
Cool. Yeah, yeah, that's all I had. Just kind of letting you know I'm still alive.
Nice.
Thanks.
Anybody else have thoughts or questions for Mark?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if it makes any sense, but when you're asking about everything and unions, I was wondering if directives makes any sense at all. It's just another one for the list. I can't think of any use right now.
I think it probably does. If you want to be able to refer to an argument of a directive, then what does that look like? And is that different? Worth
I
including.
was worried it might get a little complicated.
Potentially. I think it could make sense. You start that with an @ sign to make it clear that it's a directive or something like that.
We've got something internally we've been playing with to differentiate something for directives. We did have to do just that and prefix it with an @ sign. So if I mean we've done that, but I don't know. Anyway, I just thought I'd bring it up. Mark's gonna think about it.
Yeah,
I am gonna think about that. Okay. Yeah, I'll avoid hot takes right now. I'll discuss it at the RFC.
Maybe a thought that I had as a way that you can kind of tease through the things that may or may not require a schema coordinate. Find all the places where we allow you to use documentation in the type definition language. Presumably anything that could be documented might also want to have a schema coordinate. That might be a good superset.
Yeah.
Whittle down from there.
Yeah. No, I'm just thinking like which way around would it be for directives? Because you can have like the definition of the directive in SDL, but then you also have like the place where the directive is applied, and like the directive can take arguments. So there's like a couple ways around.
And when you're using it, you can have a repeatable directive.
What do you mean by repeatable by directive? Oh, where you just apply it multiple times. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So I just mean, so how do you, if you're trying to name a specific one, that seems like a more complicated coordinate.
You should be clear if your coordinates are pointing to things within a document or things within a schema. So if they're pointing within a document, then you need to be able to say at this particular branch, this directive on this field. If you're pointing within a schema, there's just only ever one, that's just the definition of the directive you're talking about. That might help resolve.
Yeah, I think also to clarify, the scope or the intended scope of this RFC is just for schemas rather than like documents. Because I mean, there's already like a language, like the fields array thing for queries.
You still have uses of directives in schemas, not just the definition of the directives.
Yeah. So like, yeah, that's where kind of the ambiguity might come. Are you talking about the definition of the directive, or are you talking about where the directive is applied in the schema on a type or a field somewhere? We'll probably need
Sounds like a good thing for you to think through next.
Yeah. No, thanks. Yeah, it's a good discussion.
All right, Benji, back to you to give an update on tag types.
Yeah. I gotta find the relevant tab. Oh gosh, I was busy taking notes and I've opened too many things and now I've lost where I am. I'm going to open it from the notes. There it is. Okay. So yeah, this is broadly an update. We spoke about tag types, I think a couple of working groups ago, where previously to that, we'd raised the idea that we were going to introduce this, potentially introduce this new type. So I worked up the original RFC for that. We got a decent amount of feedback on that. So thank you to everyone who has contributed. There have been some really good bits of feedback, and I've tried to incorporate as many of them as I can into the spec edits themselves. There are still a few ongoing discussions. So I guess one thing I could do here to update you is say what sort of things have changed in what we're proposing for the tagged type. So one of the most recent changes, which I haven't yet reflected in the spec edits, because I only wrote this up yesterday, is that we currently don't think that we're going to allow for tag types to be valid against both input and output. So at the time that you define a tagged type, you will declare whether or not it is an input or an output tagged type. Further, it's rather controversial whether or not we add the tag type to output, as we always knew it would be. So I have taken some time to write some of the justifications as to why we might want to allow the tag type in output. I know quite a few people are heavily leaning towards only using the tag type for input, but in case we want to introduce it for output in future, it definitely makes sense to solve the problems now. For example, if we were to just decide that the tag type is going to be input only for now, and we just called it in the SDL, in the schema language, if we just said tagged foo is this, then in future it would potentially limit how we would then add it to output. It might be a tagged output foo, and at that point the like consistency might be limited. So if we decide that we might in future allow it in output, but at the moment we're not going to, we should probably make sure that however we add it at this point is done in such a way that a future addition of the output doesn't look inconsistent. So that's one of the things that we are currently considering. I have also outlined almost a flowchart, not exactly a flowchart, it's just a numbered list, but a list of when you would use the various output types, whether you would use an interface, a union, or a tagged type. I don't think that interfaces really enter into this discussion too much. Excuse me. I don't think they factor in too much because I think the rules around interfaces are relatively clear. So if, for example, you're building a field that will return one of many object types, and it would make sense for the client if all of those object types were to return a set of fields that relate to that field. So for example, if you're searching for products within a store, it might make sense to make sure that whatever it returns will always have a name, a price, and maybe a description or something like that. So there you would use like the shoppable product interface or whatever. If that applies to your data, most likely you want an interface, and that's kind of the end of that discussion. If you don't have the commonality in your types, then you're not going to be using interface. So then it comes down to why would you use a union versus a tagged? And I think for my reasoning for this, and it is challenging because, as has been pointed out, there is definitely overlap. The tag type introduces a lot more flexibility versus the union. So for example, the tag type can do almost like a union over not just object types, but also other unions, interfaces, other tags. It can do it over scalars, over enums. It can do it over lists of any of these previous things as well. So it does allow for a much richer expression. And now obviously it's not saying it could be any of these things. You have to define which ones you're going to allow. So it's not allowing, it's not almost like next to an any type. It is still very strongly typed, and you can define which ones make sense. But that can be useful for particular data sources that do allow for this polymorphic data. So my rules are basically, if it makes sense to use an interface, use an interface. If you think that you're going to be returning object types, but you might in future also want to return scalars or return lists or enums from your field, then it would make sense to use a tagged output because it saves you that, it gives you that option for the future. Would you like to do something where you have a polymorphic output type and you want that to match your polymorphic input type and to be of a similar structure, or even potentially even a symmetric structure. If so, potentially use the tagged output type. And this one's more interesting. Are you considering non-technical users as using an interface like GraphQL or something like that within your schema? Because if you're exposing that kind of interface to users, the fragment syntax is very programmery, you know, ... spread on selection set, whereas the tagged queries is very much just like querying an object type. So it's consistent with the rest of your schema. So it can actually, I believe, be a lot simpler for people who are new to GraphQL or less technical to use it. So I think if you're factoring in that, then maybe use the tag type. And in all other cases, you could choose between them, but most likely the union type is the one for you because it's flatter and it has a couple of other advantages as well.
But that means what you said is that essentially we split the tag type. So we make it explicit clear now that it's in an output context only or in an input context only.
Yes. So at the moment, the proposal is that this is still the same type. So whereas like the input type and the object type are two different types in GraphQL, we're proposing that the tagged would be one type, which would have a property that declares whether or not it is valid for input or valid for output. And the reason for that is it saves the option value if in future we do want to allow a tagged to be both input and output, it allows for that. And also broadly, the capabilities of a tagged don't really differentiate between those two use cases. So
yep.
Fields don't accept arguments and things like that.
Yeah, but there were a lot of issues, or I think when I read this first time, it doesn't felt clean, the implementation. You had to do a lot of checks, like if you introduce output types into the tag type, it becomes an output type. And if you just have input types in it, it's an input type. So there's a lot of validation around that you suddenly have to do, whereas at the moment, it's very clear what is in an output type. So having...
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That is what was previously proposed. All of that has been put in the bin. So now when you declare your tagged type, you declare whether or not it is an input or an output variant. So there is none of this validation. There is no dependency on the other types in the schema. You can look at a tag type and you will know immediately whether that is an input or an output type. And there is no need to know what is going on in the rest of the schema.
Okay, so it's just so we don't need another keyword. You basically have a property there.
Yeah, so we don't need another keyword. We don't need an extra type in the introspection system. We don't need an extra set of fields for various places. And I don't think adding those things actually would give us any value, because I don't think that we would want to evolve the input and output versions of tagged in separate ways. I don't think. Hopefully this won't come back to bite us.
Yeah, certainly the dynamically determining whether that type is allowed to be used in an input or output context. That always felt like the most fragile piece of the original proposal. And so I really like that this does away with that by making it explicit. They do kind of feel like different kinds of things, right? Like when you describe it at a high level, they feel like the same thing. But I remember the first time going through feedback in the detailed out spec edits, the behaviors of a input tagged and the behaviors of an output tagged are pretty different, right? Like they do different things. And do you think it's like what's actually the cost of just we have a tag, output tagged and input tagged, as opposed to this sort of property keyword? want to make sure we're making a good decision there. I think I'm with you on the proposal. I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate a bit, just to make sure that we understand why it's valuable to make these the same thing.
Yeah, I think part of the value of the tagged is the intention that it is effectively a stripped down version of almost an intersection of the input and output base object types. So it only, like, you have fields that don't have arguments, they have nullability. Broadly, it kind of, it describes the same thing, whether it were an input or an output. If it only had scalars in it, it would look identical for both. Really, it's just whether you put the input keyword or output keyword next to it, potentially. But it might make sense to use different things for it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to complicate the introspection too much for it as well. For example, they could both use the new members field. I apologize about my background noise if you're picking that up. So they apologize. So they may still use the members field in introspection to find out what the fields are and what the types are and whether they're nullable and other such things, because that works the same for both. One potential issue there is, of course, on an output tagged, it only makes sense to have output types. Whereas on an input tagged, it only makes sense to have input types. And it might well be that because of that, there is some cascading logic that we might need to factor in. I don't think we need to at this point, but maybe there's a situation where that could be an issue. I haven't managed to think it up. But broadly, they are similar. Like, they look the same in SDL. And I think conceptually, they are meant to be the same. It's just one is valid on input and one is valid on output. But like, it would be much clearer if we were still allowing the both input and output type, that they are effectively the same. But at the moment, we're proposing that we don't have that.
The argument against that is, I mean, if you look from a high-level perspective on SDL, and you take input objects and output objects next to each other, and you take the arguments away, then they look similar, but they are completely different things. Like, input is just about providing raw data, whereas when you have output types, there's processing, there is resolving data. It's a complete different functionality, which would change that. There is overlap, both have fields, but I don't think that such overlap necessitates that we have like one base type. I think it rather would complicate if you think from an implementation perspective, where you just, because you have some similarity in tools that you use, like for validation logic or stuff, you choose to bind them to a base class, if you follow what I mean. So it could be useful really to keep it separate, because that's also the clean thing about GraphQL, that it really makes this distinction between these types.
I think one of the interesting things about the tagged type is that from an implementation point of view, and obviously this will differ depending on what programming languages you're implementing it with, but broadly it follows the existing object type and input type logic. So validation works in very much the same way. Resolution works in very much the same way. It's just simplified. There is a couple of extra clauses, like it may only have one field, and that is like one check and done. And obviously on the output fields, like they don't accept arguments, so you wouldn't factor in arguments during resolution, but that's just the same as having no arguments, which fields already have. So from an implementation point of view, I think it should be relatively easy to implement. It is, after all, based on this concept of just having the one-of directive, where you just say it's the same as it always was, except no arguments, and you can only have one of them.
Kind of, because if you provide, at least it's in .NET, it would translate, like a resolver would translate into a method, whereas the raw data just is properties. So there are distinct different things that you have to have there, and you. I don't know if it's with other languages, like in Java, you don't have properties in that way. So you have functions, but then you would have different functions, like you would have a setter and a getter function. So they are different things.
Yeah, okay, I hear what you're saying, but I don't think that the tag type like necessarily even needs resolvers. Like the default resolver would effectively be what you would use. The idea is the parent field returns an object that conforms to the tag type, and then you just return the default field on it. Now it's up to the implementation whether they want to actually go ahead and implement the resolvers just like you would on an object type, but it's not necessary. So from the point of view of what's happening in memory, whether it's an input or an output, it's an object that has one key that references another thing, like a scalar or an object. That would be the same for an input as it would be for an output. Your implementation might choose to model it in a different way, and that's fine. And I don't think the spec really cares either way how you do that, but you don't have to. It doesn't need resolvers. From the point of view of like GraphQL.js, for example, we just use the default resolver and just not give people a way of specifying custom ones potentially.
I know that Facebook's union type, it may have evolved since then, since I last messed around with it, but it had a default resolver behavior that looked at the instance type of the thing that was coming back and made sure that that thing had a matching GraphQL type and everything could just kind of flow. But you could override that and you could say, oh, it's a union type. Here's how you resolve that to an actual concrete object type based on the thing that comes back from the underlying function. I expect we'd want to do something similar to tagged. I think like there's definitely value in keeping the concepts the same. It means that there's fewer things to teach, right? Even though the behaviors are a little bit different in input and output, that there's value there for sure. One thing that I think is a really strong benefit from your proposal here of making input and output explicit is that a implementation could actually decide to treat these as two completely different things if it wanted to. You could, when you're defining your schema in terms of code, you could have a input tag and an output tagged as two completely different building blocks within your schema. Whereas before, that being a dynamic thing, you couldn't actually do that. You'd have to define the rules for how to do both inputs and outputs anytime you used a tag type, even if you only intended it to ever be used in one example. And that's probably a reason why that was not the right path to go on, where I think this resolves it. But this is a conversation I'm glad we're having. I want to make sure that we're not missing something or creating undue burden on implementers or consumers of these types in making them similar. My sense is that this ends up being mostly just a semantic difference in the SDL as to whether you use two keywords versus one merged keyword or something like that, where it should be relatively invisible to most clients of a server how your server is actually implementing it. Another thought that I had that we might want to talk through is whether it would ever make sense to limit a directive to only ever apply to an output tagged versus an input tagged. So this is, I think you have a section in your comment about, or maybe it was a feedback earlier about the different directive locations and seeing the tagged member as being one of those. And that's useful because you can, there may be a case where you want to be able to say something specific about a tagged member that does not make sense in the context of an object or an input type. And so it's important that you can specifically target those things or exclude those things for any custom directive. But would we want one that's like this custom directive only ever makes sense in the context of an input tagged, and it doesn't make sense in the context of an output tagged, or vice versa? That would warrant them being kind of different things, different directive locations. Or is that only theoretical?
I don't use directives heavily, so I'm not very good at coming up with examples. I have not come up with an example of that yet. One thing, just to slightly distract from that topic for a moment, one thing that I have thought about is that at the moment, I think on every field in a GraphQL query, you can issue the skip or include directives. And while we haven't explicitly stated that you can or cannot do that for the tagged fields, I don't think it makes sense to do that, perhaps. Maybe it does. But at the moment, it's not explicitly allowed on that member target type. That is an example potentially of one where it only makes sense on output, right? It wouldn't make sense to omit on skip, sorry, to skip something on input. But that wouldn't be where you would apply that kind of, that would be more of a schema definition one rather than a document one. You wouldn't have anywhere to put it in the input document anyway.
Can I offer, before we go to more details, maybe can I offer more like a fundamental criticism? I'm not overly happy with this RFC, to be honest. I see the awesome work put into, and I see how it solves actually the original problem of input union things quite satisfactory. So this is definitely valid in my opinion, and I don't see strong opinion or strong reasons not to go forward to solve the original input union problem. But I'm not convinced that. I'm really worried about adding this output type into the mix for two reasons. First, I must say, from a practical schema design point of view, interfaces versus union is a real problem. I have to disagree with you, Benji, on this. Like, I'm engaging with teams as part of my job, and one of the persistent topics that come up over time is always, should I model this as an interface or as a union or as both or with an interface hierarchy and at the end of a union? So there is already, I would say, a non-clear schema design questions around interfaces versus union. I see this over and over the years. So adding another thing into the mix would make this already problematic area, I must say, even worse. So that's So I would even go so far, and I actually even like the proposal. I think Nick brought up. He mentioned it on the RFC that Lee, you, Nick, and Dan discussed like interfaces versus union, and Nick actually proposed having like an empty interface and non-unions. And I would even go so far from a practical point of view, it looks like even this would have been better, to be honest. So going further in the direction, adding more things into the mix, I'm really concerned about. And the second thing about our process, it feels a little bit, I think we are jumping a little bit ahead here. Like we applied a lot of scrutiny to the original ideas of input union, like there's a huge effort over years discussing the different proposals, and it's an awesome work, I must say, and it's an awesome, it's great that this community can come to a conclusion after such a long time, but I feel like we are applying here this symmetry argument quite easily and saying, look, we want to add also like an output option to this. And I don't think we have applied the same criteria to the output idea as we have for the input one. So it really feels like this is like this typical argument where you want to make it nice from a design point of view because you want to make it symmetric, but not really with I don't think we have invested the same time of mind to justify an output time. If this
Andy,
makes sense.
I broadly agree with you. And as you may have noticed from my previous pull request with regard to the query type, my approach is go all in and then pull it back. And that's what I've done here as well. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I think we may want an output version of this in future. I actually quite like it, and I would like it for my own projects. But again, as you say, there is confusion between whether to use it for interfaces or unions or the tag type in outputs. And yeah, there's definitely discussion around that. And I think the inclusion of the output version of this in the spec should be subject to a separate process, potentially. That said, I think it should be evaluated because this type could support both. So let's make sure that there is a good road forward to support both should we decide that that is necessary. And that's why I'm putting in the effort at the moment to make sure that we're not making decisions that are going to cause us problems if we later want to introduce this type to output. So I don't think that this proposal at the moment is saying that both types will be added. It's more saying this is what it would look like if both were added. And probably towards the end, we'll trim out the output type because it is controversial. And we'll then potentially have a separate push to then open it up to output. I agree with you. Interfaces and unions are challenging. And I think in most cases, I would probably choose the tag type over the union type. I think interfaces are broadly very useful, whereas the union is, as you say, it's like an interface with no fields. And I think using the tag type in that place in most cases would probably make sense. I do worry that it's kind of pushing us down the const let versus var, nobody uses var anymore kind of route. And it's maybe a bit early in GraphQL's lifetime to do that. And there are still advantages to union. So it is not clear cut. But yeah, as you say, if it had only ever been interface and now we were introducing tag type to the output, I don't think it would be particularly controversial. It is because of the existence of union that is the issue.
You put that really well, Benji. I'm happy that you are exploring it in this way, and I think it's probably wise to eventually cut this in half, and so that there's two separate proposals moving forward. But it's very smart to consider them as part of a overall vision, because I think it's problematic to really get narrow and avoid the context.
I think I've lost Lee. Has anyone else lost Lee?
Maybe he's
Yeah,
just
the
thinking.
same.
Me too. I just see you.
He just speaks very quietly. No.
And sits very still.
Yes. No, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe just reconnecting.
I think he said you could just ship it. So
merge it quickly.
also, Benji, I'm having like a little trouble keeping up with the notes. I don't know how you do this every time.
With great difficulty. I hope it's better now because we get the YouTube uploads afterwards. So if there is anything, just put some question marks in there, and we can go back through the video afterwards, jump to the relevant point, and hopefully fill it back out.
Yeah, the video is super helpful.
I haven't done that yet because obviously I don't have enough time to then go and watch the working group twice. But I think what would be really excellent is if we started somehow adding timestamps to the notes as we took them. That would allow us to very easily reference the relevant point in the YouTube video.
Yeah, I actually never use the notes. I straight now go to the video because the notes sometimes are too compressed, and it's I think it's great that we have the video.
I think notes are particularly useful for just doing a search, across the repo. But yeah, definitely the video is the source of truth. So now we have those. Reference that. Sorry, Andy.
Does our Zoom videos also come in with the Zoom like textual output of the meeting? Like I don't know what the English word for is, but like
they do with captions. Yeah. With captions, you mean?
Ah, yes, exactly. Auto captions.
Yeah.
Do we have this?
Yeah.
Speech to text.
I have some background on that. So I wasn't sure. I have access to Zoom, GraphQL Foundation. So, but I wasn't sure about like limits and like can we actually publicly share it. So I shared like transcripts, video with transcripts with Benji. But now I have confirmation from Brian that we can actually share Zoom recording with automatic transcript publicly. But one thing that Brian warned us about is that we should not depend on them in documents because GraphQL Foundation have like storage limit for Zoom account. So at some point, old videos will disappear. So what I can do is I can share transcript of like every working group until now, including this one. And you can use automatic transcript and timestamps, but you should not put references to them in like document, action items, anything else.
Can't we just put them to YouTube?
I mean, we do that already, no?
Yeah, then they are there.
Yeah, and then presumably we can just like pull the speech to text transcript from like the YouTube auto caption thing, and my wrists can stop hurting.
Yeah, that's what I actually with the Hot Chocolate community stand up. We do that. Just put to YouTube and then share the YouTube link. Then you can even skip to the right time and say, okay, yeah, watch that from. So you have proper references.
We do link to the videos from the notes now and from the agendas. What I found with the transcription is it is of mixed utility. Sometimes it's really good, and sometimes it is just gibberish. So yeah, I think there's value in taking the notes, I think, and particularly where the notes manage to, as you say, compress the content down. It can help you get the gist of a conversation without actually having to read through or watch through the entire conversation. Often scanning with your eyes is a lot quicker to find the information you're after than having to skip through a video.
True. But sorry, Andy, go ahead.
Lee shared in the GraphQL Slack room that his internet died. So I'm not sure how quickly he will come back. But let me try to finish his thought, his train of thought. I think he was referring to that it's really helpful to have the overall vision of the tag types like outlined and considered. And I think this is, I agree with him that looking at the solution from a holistic point of view makes sense, that we don't miss anything moving forward. I think this was also your idea, Benji, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the approach that you want to take.
Yeah, so I think that's really important. But I would actually ask, can we kind of formulate this vision outside of the RFC? Like, do we have a concise vision about, I don't know, concise input versus output types, or like a bigger union type, or like what is actually the vision we are trying to have? Like, is this anywhere written down, or is it just in your head, Benji, or on Lee's head, or maybe we could try to kind of separate this vision from the implementation of these types and yeah, have in this way a better picture.
Well, you can boil my vision down to what I said about 1.5 years ago, which is, why don't we just take the input and output types and only let them have one field? That is my vision. And this is an implementation of that vision. And that is, you know, we've got to the point where we've evaluated this idea of having one field against all the other options for input unions. And we found that the one field idea is currently the leading idea. But that's all the vision is. Now it is, how do we turn this vision into a reality? And as part of that, you know, we're writing the spec edits and we're seeing what the knock-on consequences are, and we're thinking about what the effects are going to be on introspection, what the effects are going to be on code generation, on writing the implementation. As Michael quite rightly pointed out, there are complexities there, and we want to make sure that we address all of those things. So yeah, it's
maybe there's another vision, maybe that's only Lee's head, that the input types should be quite symmetrical to the output types in terms of capabilities. Maybe that's another vision or goal, or like some aspiration we have. You know, like the symmetry aspect, if you add it to the input, it should be similar feature or capability should be in the output types. Maybe that's another.
Yeah, I think that is, as you say, like, as many people point out, this is one of the solutions that was thrown in with the input unions lot, which makes sense because it solves input polymorphism. But it was always a bit of an outlier in the input unions thing, because it is more of a, it's not really a union. It's you know, it's a tagged type, which is not really a union. Anywho, but yeah, there is this separate idea of the symmetry, and that is something that we already kind of have with input and output types. So it's very common to have a schema that might have, say, a user output and then a user input type that has broadly the same fields, probably fewer, because you wouldn't necessarily have things like friends on the input, but you would have it on the output, let's say, but broadly similar. And a lot of people think of their APIs as ways of getting data in and out of, you know, a database or something like that, you know, getting data in and out of the server. And it often makes sense to get data in from the server, manipulate it, and send it back again. And you don't really want that process to be complicated. So having symmetry keeps that, reduces the number of like mental gymnastics you have to do when moving from output to input or vice versa. So I think symmetry is desirable. I don't think it is necessarily 100% necessary. Like, it is a nice to have, but yeah, I think that's probably a goal. Yeah,
although
I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Although I have to say, that's most of the times how users start with it, thinking in symmetry, thinking then in patch commands where they send in the user object as is and trying to patch changes into the database. But as soon as schemas grow, they are mostly going away from that and applying more other concepts, more specific mutations. And really, if you send in a user, you have a friends list, then you might send in the friends IDs, which is then a completely different field than on the output. So as soon as you go into bigger schemas, and more mature projects, this is not true anymore, I would say.
Yeah, completely agree. But GraphQL is used by companies large and small, so I think
Yeah,
it's reasonable to target all.
I agree.
I like that way of thinking about that, Michael, of starting with the tight symmetry, but allowing space for them to diverge when you need them to. It's actually, in hindsight, I'm really happy with how input objects and output types work, because they do have a lot of symmetry. They both have fields. It's easy to think in terms of both of them as being very similar. And only when you get into the details do you realize how they can be quite different. And I think that's the thing that feels most annoying about our existing union type and all of the proposals we've had so far with input unions, is that the trying to apply like a symmetric approach to input unions that starts with our output unions is just really unsatisfying. And that's not great. And I'm really happy to see the parallel exploration of inputs and outputs. I want to kind of resolve our discussion here so there's space to go back and iterate on these things. But it does seem like what a clear next step is to kind of articulate a bit of a vision for how all these pieces come together and why we're thinking about them holistically at first, and then to start to tease them apart so we can address input unions or input tags as an independent thing and resolve those and kind of close this multi-year saga as Andy framed it up, and then provide some space for treating in or output tag types on its own merits. And I think there's certainly more discussion that we want to have there, and I don't think we want to hold up input tags on resolving all of those. And giving it its own space will be a worthwhile thing. But one thing is pretty clear, which is it's really valuable to have the space for that to have some symmetry. So one thing that's pretty clear is naming this tag type in a way that doesn't explicitly make it only ever an input type. So making it input tags or tag input or something like that in the syntax is pretty smart in my opinion. Because it makes it provides some room for us to explore that design space on the output side. And I also think that, if we were going to rebuild GraphQL from scratch from first principles, my personal opinion is we'd probably go do something with tag types instead of union types, now that we kind of know how people use them. Because I kind of agree with all the kind of usability pain points that you've pointed out so far. But I want to make sure we have some time, so we're going to move forward on our agenda and do an update on the GraphQL JS working group. So Uri and Yvonne, I'll hand it to you both.
I think Uri, as part of this effort, Uri volunteered to aggregate action items and track them, and have a roadmap issue, roadmap project on GitHub. So I feel like it makes sense for it to give updates, and it's nice initiative to share some responsibility in GraphQL JS project.
Uri, are you still here?
If Uri is not available, I can do it myself. So, and Uri, if you have microphone issues or something, you can interrupt me at any time. So basically, core issue was finding a way how to communicate with people who want to help and become maintainer and have onboarding experience. So we had GraphQL JS working group call. It's recorded on YouTube, and a couple of people volunteered to help. So I didn't advertise this code too much because I feel like we need to start with some number of people and then grow it. So it was mostly a couple of people and the guild members. and people who volunteer to help with like triage issues, like triaging and categorizing them, or like creating roadmaps. I think it's like risk, in a sense, it's risk-free because it's not changing the rules or not publishing, not changing code or not publishing new package. So it's like everything can be reversed. So I just went ahead and I triage everybody who was interested. I give them triage rules, and we will see how this experiment will go. Also, there is like a bunch of items on me. Hopefully, like on next GraphQL working group, we will have like items evenly distributed between members as part of bootstrapping. So like, actually, like one issue is kind of interesting, and I don't feel like I'm empowered to make this decision, but should we have a common policy for onboarding new maintainers? Because Uri raised this question. So is it like, there is three option. We have like rules for onboarding new maintainers on one set of rules for all foundation projects. Like every project through working group decide on its own, or we just like have, it's like it's too early and we can be pretty flexible and do it on case-by-case basis. So it's a question actually like, hi Uri. So yeah,
Hi, sorry,
my
like I was here and listening everything, but I couldn't talk. So sorry, continue.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's a question. I feel like I'm not the right person to answer myself. Yeah, because it's like generic one. So Lee, what do you think about that, or like what's the mechanism? So if we decided on per project basis, we can discuss it on GraphQL working group and define it there. If we want to have like some basic rules for all foundation project, it's like we need some mechanism to do it.
We're in a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem where, you know, really you only want to define rules for these things once you've seen patterns of what's working and not working. So you codify the rules that are working that protect against the things that have gone wrong. We just haven't had a big expanse of maintainers across a wide surface area of projects where defining those things will add a lot of value. So in my opinion, we should treat them all as one-offs just because the volume is low. If we get to the point where there's a lot of new maintainers showing up across a bunch of projects, then I don't want to be in the position to like personally approve each of them because like I'll just become a roadblock and that won't be valuable for anybody. And even delegating that across some committee, maybe that's like a part of the technical steering committee's job or something like that. It's like, it takes it off of my head, but it just moves it onto the head of a like organization. And so that'll still create roadblocks. So my suggestion, and we can codify this in foundation rules later if we want to, is each individual project should be able to sort of self-govern except for when there's cases where they can't come to reasonable conclusions, in which case they can escalate. So if the folks who are currently maintainers of GraphQL.js feel like somebody would be a valuable additional maintainer to GraphQL.js, then by all means, that's your project to manage and do that. If there's questions, concerns, or a decision can't be made, then I think it's reasonable to raise that to this group or to somebody else within the foundation.
Okay, I will basically ping Matt because he's like also active on a repo, and plus it like it's less opinionated in that way because he can also have like some input on that.
Yeah.
And yes, it's actually we have this as action item to write some criteria. Yeah, it can be actually as part of contributing MD. We can have it there. Like side note about volume of new contributors. Like I didn't like new contributors. Like I added Caroline as part of season of docs, and for GraphQL or HTTP, I added like 2 new contributors. And another issue I wanted to discuss: can we have a policy that if person not contributing for a year, we send him notice email saying like you didn't contribute it for a year. Do you want to continue? And if person is not responding in reasonable time or is not or say like I don't have time to contribute or I don't want to contribute, we just remove him. Is it
Seems
like reasonable?
Yeah, I think
yeah,
so.
and 1 year is reasonable time frame.
Yeah, because
Okay.
some of these projects are on a slow cadence. GraphQL JS is pretty proactively developed, but some of the other ones are less so. And if those are the ones that people can kind of like have a background process maintenance of, then that can be okay. A year sounds fine to me. I think it's also reasonable for it to be on judgment, but if you want to have a written rule so that you can kind of point to something and say, here's when we send these out, I think that's fine.
Yeah, plus I don't think it's like we're not kicking person after 1 year. We're just asking him if he wants to. So it's not binding in a sense. Okay, so let's address another action item because we have like 60 contributors on GraphQL JS, and I'm like kind of feel like the more people we add, the more unmanageable it become, including like some security implications. So yeah. Okay, so I think I had all inputs on all action items. I'm like on me at the moment. By the way, if Uri or somebody else is interested in helping with writing template for sending to these people, I feel like it probably should still be me because I will remove them if they say okay. But like it will help me a lot if like because it should be like polite and with good explanation. So yeah, if somebody interested in helping to write with like notice, we can use it across other projects. So yeah, it's everything on my side. Maybe Uri have some other items.
Yeah, thanks, and sorry for that my sound didn't work at the beginning. Yeah, first of all, thanks Ivan for making this working group happen. It was really exciting, and I'm happy we're starting it. I think the most important thing is that we could make it maybe a regular cadence, so like maybe each month or something like that, so we know already like when the next meeting would be, and then we can check up on the tasks for it accordingly and see that we make progress. I think for me there were like 3 biggest topics during the working group. One was like 2 of them related to, let's call it the buzz factor. Like one is how can we make even your work better? Meaning like a list of all the things that we need to do in order to minimize, that you will, when you get something to review or to do something, you have as little work as possible. So there are some tasks on that. And the other one is like, can we get more events? Like, can we increase actually like and get more people that also can review and can commit and everything? And I think there is like, yeah, so we have a bunch of tasks from there as well. All those tasks are now documented in the working group issue. I'll link it here later. And also I'm encouraging everyone to join to those working groups as well. The last one is like, I think was actually about, the work itself, which is, and I think currently what's the most needed thing is actually kind of a clear roadmap because there's a lot of people who want to contribute, I think, us as being one of them, and some of them are like in progress. There's a lot of changes that we're making, and I think currently, because of the bus factor, we're not sure exactly, we're up to doing more work. We're just not sure exactly what should be that next work in order to make it happen. And I think, like you said, Ivan, while you were talking, I think currently there's probably, it means just more work for you, because now you're the main person there, and you have the perspective, and you're the one who needs to say, this is ready or not ready. Hopefully, well, after this first wave of tasks, there will be less work. It will actually lead to having less work and less stress over you, and we could share more of that work together. But yeah, other than that, I was very happy that it happened, and I'm excited for the next meeting.
I want to share some perspective, and actually I think it's helpful for other foundation projects. It was a couple of iterations of trying to onboard more people. And the thing that I learned is these three things actually connected, and you need to do them in proper order. So if you just put publicly that you need help with something, but you don't have contribution guides, or you don't explain, it's put a lot of previewing effort on you, and after that, the PR is not reviewed for a long time, and it demotivate people who contribute. The same thing is with onboarding new content. So I mean, my feeling after trying it with different projects and trying it for a couple of times is, first you need to define contribution, what you expect from PR and what you expect from people. When you need to say what kind of help you need and what the topics people should work on. And the third component is to onboard with people. First thing I will work on is to define what expect from PRs, because if I just advertise I need help with something, it will just overflow my review capacity. But I totally agree with you. So true solution of bus factor is actually have more people. It's not more effective reviewing process for a person. For me, at this moment of format, it's more for having more contributors through solution. But in this bootstrap process, I'm bottleneck at the moment. So and I don't see a way how to have a good quality contribution without reviewing process and dropping quality level. So that's why first thing is to define what to expect and contribution rules.
Sounds like a great update. It looks like you guys have good next steps on meeting more regularly and adding more maintainers to offload the bus factor from Ivan. Thanks for the update. Cool. That is all of our agenda. Any additional things y'all want to talk about in the few minutes we have remaining?
I want to have some announcement. I onboard 2 new people as maintainers of, and more is actually here on this call. So GraphQL over HTTP, and we plan to do experiment on doing asynchronous working group. So more stuff is done asynchronously instead of on the calls, and we will see how it works. And we can share after that. We can share experience with other working groups, because at the moment we already have 4 different working groups. So yeah, interesting experiment to try to do it asynchronously.
And with asynchronously, you mean you're working on the issues rather than meeting up? Okay.
Nice. All right, folks. Another great meeting. Talked through a lot of excellent topics. Great to see forward momentum on many RFCs and other parts of the GraphQL ecosystem. Always happy to see all of your faces. I'll see all of you next month.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.